On September 18, 1989, American musician William Martin Joel released a song that is perhaps one of the greatest encapsulations of Cold War history ever produced. The rock and/or roll song in question runs as a list of memorable people and events that took place after the artist's birth in 1949, leading up to the release of the song. These dates just happen to largely coincide with generally accepted major dates of the Cold War. So while I personally don't think that this is either the best Cold War song or even my favorite Cold War song, it is a little slice of Cold War history wrapped up in a catchy tune. I'm your host David, and today we are going to run through the list of people and events on Billy Joel's 1989 classic hit, We Didn't Start the Fire. This is the Cold War. So, a bit of background on the song itself. Joel wrote it in 1989 at the age of 40 in reaction to a conversation he had with a 21-year-old he met in studio who believed that 1989 was a worse time to be at that age than someone who grew up in the 1950s, as the world in 1989 was an unfixable mess. Joel's response was that all 21-year-olds felt similarly, and Joel, a self-described history nut, decided to start outlining the events that had transpired in his lifetime. Joel had also indicated that the song started as a country song, but shifted to rock and roll. Released in September 1989 on his album Stormfront, We Didn't Start the Fire was met with mixed critical reception, but was commercially a hit, going to number 1 on the US Billboard chart, and has been certified 6 times platinum since then. That's over 6 million units sold in the US, for those who may be interested. Despite this, Joel never liked the song, describing it to interviewer David Horn in 1993 as really not much of a song. If you take the melody by itself, terrible, like a dentist drill. The song, however, is upbeat and catchy, and the lyrics would have had some great name recognition for most listeners in at least their mid to late teens and older. The lyrics are just a stream of consciousness chronological listing of significant events, people, and places from Joel's life. As a listener, you don't need to know each specific reference, as it is about catching the ones you do know. The song also benefited from a spot of luck in the timing of its release, just ahead of the fall of the Berlin Wall. This gives the song a sense of capturing an era. On being asked about the timing, Joel has said, quote, "It was just my luck that the Soviet Union decided to close down shop soon after putting out the song." Okay, so with that bit of background, here we go. The song begins with a reference to Harry Truman. Truman was, of course, the 33rd President of the United States and was inaugurated into his second term on January 20th, 1949, after a surprise victory in the 1948 election. Truman is notable for such things as the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, and remilitarizing the United States during the Korean War. His presidency helped establish the format of the Cold War. Next comes Doris Day, a singer and actress most well known for her 1947 hit song Que Sera Sera, after which she began a successful film career while continuing to release hit music. Then Joel refers to Red China, which is acknowledgement of Mao's 1949 victory in the Chinese Civil War, giving control of mainland China to the communists. The loss of China would have far-reaching policy decisions in the United States for decades to come. Johnny Ray is a reference to the piano-playing musician who, in the early 1950s, rose to prominence playing a mix of jazz and blues, and is often credited as being an early developer of what was to become rock and roll. Ray, a white man, acted as an acceptable bridge between the black musicians playing blues and jazz and the growing white audience listening to the music. South Pacific is a reference to the Rodgers and Hammerstein Broadway musical of the same name that debuted in 1949. The musical itself is based on some of the stories from James Michener's Tales of the South Pacific, itself a Pulitzer Prize winner. South Pacific has been highly successful, and revivals continue to be mounted in the US and the UK. Walter Winchell was a newspaper columnist who had established a career in the 1930s denouncing fascism, and by the late 1940s and 50s had joined the McCarthy bandwagon in denouncing communism as the greatest threat to the United States, often by means of personal attacks and denunciations against those who had crossed him. Joe DiMaggio is of course the baseball player who in 1949 signed a new contract with the New York Yankees for a whopping $100,000. In 1949, this was a staggering amount of money, and DiMaggio became the first baseball player to break the $100K barrier. Joe McCarthy was of course the Wisconsin senator who rose to national prominence in 1950 when he leveled accusations that the State Department had been totally infiltrated by communists and spies. He would, over the following few years, lead what amounted to a witch hunt, attacking anyone he suspected of being even somewhat left-leaning, even if things like evidence was lacking. McCarthyism has gone on to mean the defamation of character or reputation by means of widely publicized, indiscriminate allegations, especially on the basis of unsubstantiated charges. 1950 was the year that the next reference appears, Richard Nixon. This was the year that Tricky Dick would first be elected to the Senate following his involvement in the Alger Hiss case. Nixon would go on to be not only Eisenhower's vice president and would lose to Kennedy in the 1960 election, but would himself become the 37th president sworn into office in 1969. A major Nixon event gets another shout out later in the song. Next comes Studebaker, the US car manufacturer who, starting from about 1950, began a rapid decline in prosperity. This was the result of being outcompeted and left behind in the price war being waged between Ford and GM as America rapidly began its embrace, some would say obsession, with the automobile. Joel then references television, as it was from 1950 that the device began its transition from a luxury good to the now almost ubiquitous household device. Across the United States and the world, new television stations began broadcasting and programming began to really expand. The last line of the opening verse states North Korea, South Korea, as it is in 1950 that the North invades the South, sparking the Korean War, one of the seminal defining events of the Cold War. The verse ends with a reference to that blonde bombshell herself, Marilyn Monroe, who had her breakout year in 1950, appearing in 5 Hollywood films: A Ticket to Tomahawk, The Asphalt Jungle, Right Cross, The Fireball, and All About Eve. Norbert Jean Baker was on her way to enduring, if somewhat unwanted, stardom. Okay, so half a verse in and Billy Joel has only covered the first 2 years of his life. The song is, as most of us who have heard it, very much front-loaded with references to things from the 1950s. This is very much a reaction to the comments made by the young man in studio I mentioned at the start of the episode, who Joel recalled tell him, quote, "You grew up in the 1950s and everybody knows that nothing happened in the 1950s. With that being said, let's move to the second half of the first verse. The Rosenbergs reference is of course meaning Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, the husband and wife duo who had been involved in the Manhattan Project and had passed secret nuclear information to the Soviets. Convicted in 1951 and sentenced to death under the Espionage Act of 1917, a degree of doubt was woven into the levels of their guilt, specifically Ethel, and a campaign for clemency was begun, which failed by 1953 when both were executed. The next reference, H-bomb, refers of course to the 1951 decision by the US government to proceed with the development of the Super, the hydrogen bomb, the next evolution of nuclear weapons. This program would quietly come to fruition in 1952 with the Ivy Mike shot, which vaporized the island of Yalugilab in the Marshall Islands. Ivy Mike was not a weaponized hydrogen bomb, as it was the size of a warehouse, but the nuclear arms race between the Soviet Union and the US was in full swing. Sugar Ray is of course a shout out to the boxer Sugar Ray Robinson, who defeated Jake LaMotta over 13 rounds to become the undisputed world middleweight title holder in a fight referred to as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Sugar Ray Robinson went on to a distinguished boxing career and has been referred to as the best pound-for-pound boxer in history. Panmunjom, Joel's next reference, is of course the village of Panmunjom, the site where peace talks between Communist North Korea and Chinese representatives and delegates from the United Nations forces in Korea were held. These talks continued until an armistice was finally reached in 1953, bringing an end to the active fighting of the Korean War. The song then moves over to the arts of 1951, first by mentioning Brando, meaning Marlon Brando, who was nominated for an Oscar for Best Actor for his role in A Streetcar Named Desire. This firmly established Brando as a Hollywood star, and to the horror of some, he would go on to become a real godfather of acting. The next song lyric, The King and I, is a nod to the opening of the Broadway musical starring a young Yul Brynner as the King of Siam and Gertrude Lawrence as Anna. The King and I has gone on to be a Broadway and West End favorite and has spawned several big screen adaptations over the years. The last 1951 reference is to The Catcher in the Rye, a novel by J.D. Salinger, which so many teens over the world have read and fallen in love with for its themes of angst, alienation, and rebellion. Of course, it's the same book that when it's reread as an adult, people often discover that its protagonist is a phony. Eisenhower is of course the 34th President of the United States, elected in 1952 and sworn into office in early 1953. Vaccine references to the 1952 development of the polio vaccine by Jonas Salk, first tested in 1953 and then approved for full use in the United States in 1955. The mass vaccination campaigns that then followed all but eliminated polio as a public health threat, because vaccines do that. England's Got a New Queen refers to the 1952 death of King George VI and the ascension to the throne of the young Princess Elizabeth. Her coronation the following year helped spur television sales across the UK and North America. Marciano refers to Rocky Marciano, the boxer who beat Jersey Joe Walcott over 13 rounds to become the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world at the age of 37. Liberace is of course a reference to the entertainer whose TV show, The Liberace Show, first aired in 1952, catapulting him to widespread stardom. Notable for his visual flair, Liberace was among the first to take advantage of the televised medium to promote his talent. Santayana Goodbye, the last reference of the first verse, is of course George Santayana, the philosopher, writer, and poet who died in 1952. Santayana, who taught at Harvard for 26 years, is credited as being a major influence on people such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Robert Frost, T.S. Eliot, and Gertrude Stein. We didn't start the fire, it was always burning since the world's been turning. We didn't start the fire, no, we didn't light it, but we tried to fight it. The second verse, looking at 1953, kicks off with two related names, Stalin and Malenkov. This was of course the year Georgy Malenkov assumed leadership in the Soviet Union as part of a leadership troika along with Beria and Khrushchev, following Joseph Stalin's piss-soaked death. Malenkov was instrumental in the removal of Beria before losing in a race for power against Nikita Cornlord Khrushchev. The next name mentioned is Nasser Gamal Abdul. Not yet leader of Egypt, 1953 was the year he began making moves to remove Mohammad Naguib, something he would accomplish the following year. We'll come back to Egypt in a minute. Prokofiev is of course Sergei Prokofiev, the Soviet composer. He died on March 5th, the same day as Stalin, and his death went largely unnoticed and unrecognized as a result. I highly recommend you all go listen to his Violin Concerto No. 1, as soon as possible. The next line begins with Rockefeller, a reference specially to Nelson Rockefeller, according to Joel, for his time as governor of New York, although it should be noted that Nelson was only elected governor from 1959, while this section of the verse is about 1953. Sometimes artists just have to take liberties to make it work. Campanella is a nod to Roy Campanella, the Brooklyn Dodgers catcher who was named the National League's MVP for the second time in 1953. The last reference for the year is Communist Bloc, which obviously means those countries under Soviet domination, but more specifically is a nod to the 1953 East German Uprising, where the government in Berlin wanted workers to work more for less pay, and the workers collectively said, Nein. Starting into 1954, that was the year that Roy Cohn resigned as Joe McCarthy's counsel, starting to bring a close to the worst of the Red Scare, although its social impacts would last decades. Juan Perón was in his second term in Argentina and at his most popular, but had begun making changes and challenging the supremacy of the church and would see him ousted soon after. 1954 was the year that Arturo Toscanini, the next mention in the song, finally retired as conductor of the NBC Symphony Orchestra, which had been responsible for bringing decades of classical music to American ears. The baton was passed to Looney Tunes. Dacron, launched by DuPont in 1954, was the commercial name for polyethylene terephthalate, or PET, which has become the most common form of polyester fiber used in clothing. Your father or grandfather's favorite plastic shirt? Probably Dacron. Dien Bien Phu Falls is of course a reference to the surrender of the French outpost in northwest Indochina, which finally sparked the end of the First Indochina War. Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and His Comets was released that same year by Decca Records and has been credited as being the first song to bring rock and roll to a wider audience. The next block of references kicks off with 1955 and Einstein, which is the year the world-famous physicist dies at the age of 76. Brilliant man, 0 F's given haircut. 1955 is the year that James Dean catapulted to film stardom, starring in Rebel Without a Cause and East of Eden. It's also the year he died in a car crash, immortalizing the young actor at just 24 years old. Brooklyn's Got a Winning Team is a call-out to the Brooklyn Dodgers' only World Series win. The club relocated to LA in 1957. Davy Crockett refers to the Disney release of Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, a part of the American frontier mythos that was heavily leaned into at the time. Peter Pan is a reference not to the Disney movie in this case, but rather the live television broadcast of the Broadway musical adaptation of the J.M. Barrie story. It was even in color. Elvis Presley in 1955 was well on his way to becoming the king of rock and roll, and his Sun Records contract was bought out by RCA Victor for the kingly sum of $40,000. 1955 is also the year the next reference, Disneyland, opened its gates in Anaheim, California. It took several years for Nikita Khrushchev to be denied entry due to security reasons. 1956 begins with Brigitte Bardot, who catapulted to sex kitten status with her role in And God Created Women. Bardot would go on to be both an animal lover and a terrible racist. 1956 is of course the year that Budapest rose in armed revolt against its Soviet overlords. Although thousands died and many more fled, the result was a less restrictive form of imposed control until the collapse of communism 31 years later. Joel goes on to mention Alabama, where in 1956 the Montgomery bus boycott began, one of the key events of the civil rights movement in the United States. Khrushchev in 1956 refers to the 20th Party Congress and the Soviet leader's private speech denouncing the excesses of Stalin and beginning the process of dismantling the cult of personality that had been built around the Soviet dictator. Princess Grace is a reference to the actress Grace Kelly, who appeared in her final film that year before marrying Prince Rainier III of Monaco. Peyton Place refers to the best-selling book of that name, written by Grace Metalius, that proves, alongside Lady Chatterley's Lover and 50 Shades of Grey, sex sells. Trouble in the Suez, the last reference in the verse, is an understated nod to the Egyptian seizure of the Suez Canal, the joint Anglo-French-Israeli plan to take it back, and subsequent regional war that threatened to go nuclear. We didn't start the fire, it was always burning since the world's been turning. The third verse kicks off in 1957 with the mention of Little Rock, meaning the standoff that occurred in the Arkansas Capitol over integrated schooling in the state. President Eisenhower ended up federalizing the National Guard to enforce the Supreme Court ruling of Brown v. Board of Education, which banned segregated schools. 1957 was the year that Boris Pasternak had his most famous work published, Dr. Zhivago, for which he won a Nobel Prize for Literature. Due to content that was critical of the communist regime, the book had to be smuggled to Italy for publication, and Pasternak was eventually expelled from the Writers' Union. He died 3 years later. Joel then moves back to baseball and Mickey Mantle, the Yankees center fielder and renowned hitter. Mantle was at his best in 1957. Of course, 1957 was also the year that Jack Kerouac published what is possibly the defining book of the Beat generation, On the Road. If you've never read it, I strongly recommend it. Sputnik is the start of the space race, where the Soviet Union became the first nation to put an artificial satellite in orbit. Its steady pulsing sparked a panic among many Americans, growing fearful of nuclear war. Zhou Enlai, the premier of the PRC, marked 1957 by almost being blown up by a bomb on board his aircraft flying from Hong Kong to the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. Zhou was not actually on board the aircraft due to illness, but that didn't stop the KMT, and possibly the CIA, from the attempt, as has been widely suspected. Bridge on the River Kwai was one of the most successful movies of 1957, starring William Holden and Obi-Wan himself, Alec Guinness. The story told in the movie of British POWs in Burma being forced to build a railway bridge is fictional, but resonated with audiences, as did the cinematography and music. A truly great movie. Lebanon is the first reference from 1958, where the unstable political and religious agreement that had been in place since 1943 finally collapsed, leading to open fighting between divided groups. This was only stopped following Operation Blue Bat, the deployment of over 14,000 US Army soldiers and Marines. This is a really complicated series of events, but we do have a video that you can watch if you're interested, link in the show notes. Charles de Gaulle established the French Fifth Republic in 1958 following the Algerian crisis, a coup attempt led by the French military who were opposed to concessions being made in Algeria. We have a video on all of this too, link in the show notes. California baseball is a reference to not only the aforementioned Brooklyn Dodgers moving to LA that year, but also the New York Giants moving to San Francisco. That leaves you the Yankees or the Mets. Oof. Starkweather homicide is a reference to Charles Raymond Starkweather, who went on a 3-month kill spree, murdering 11 people in Nebraska and Wyoming before being arrested in January 1958. Starkweather was executed the following year. Rounding out 1958 is a reference to Children of Thalidomide. Thalidomide, introduced in 1957 and widely available in dozens of countries, was used as a sleep aid, but notably as an anti-nausea medication during pregnancy. Over the following years, a sharp increase in birth defects was noted, resulting in the drug being pulled from markets over the following years. It resulted in much stricter testing and licensing of medications in many countries. The last section of references in the third verse are all related to the events of 1959. Joel starts with the death of musician Buddy Holly in a plane crash, along with Richie Valens of Los Lobos and the Big Bopper. The day the music died, and all of that. 1959 also saw the release of Ben-Hur, which at over $15 million was the most expensive movie ever made at the time. The movie would, however, make over $146 million at the box office and win 11 Academy Awards, so probably worth it. The next reference, Space Monkey, is talking about Miss Abel and Miss Baker, a rhesus macaque and a squirrel monkey respectively, who were both launched into orbit that year and survived the trip. These missions were vital precursors to human spaceflight. Mafia, Joel's next shoutout, is a nod to the January conviction of 20 Mafia bosses following their capture and indictment after a 1957 crime boss meeting in Appalachian, New York in 1957. While the trial did prove that there was a national network of organized crime conspirators, all 20 men had their convictions overturned on appeal. On a more fun note, 1959 was the year that hula hoops passed 100 million units sold in the US. On a less fun note, 1959 was also the year of the Cuban Revolution, which saw Castro come to power, overthrowing the US-backed dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Cuba has remained a thorn in the US sides ever since. Edsel is a no-go is a reference to the failure of the much-hyped Edsel car brand, a division of Ford Motors. Uninspired designs and poor quality were hampered by a recession and losses of $250 million at the time, resulting in Edsel being shut down. Now, the first reference in the song to the 1960s is U2, with 1960 being the year that Gary Powers and his CIA spy plane was shot down by the Soviet Union, creating a rather significant international incident. 1960 is also the year that Syngman Rhee, the corrupt dictator of South Korea, won his 4th election with a staggering 100% of the vote. Anger towards this result and other election scandals triggered the April Revolution, and Rhee was flown into exile by the CIA. Payola is a reference to the 1960 congressional testimony of Not a Robot Dick Clark regarding illegal payments to DJs and radio stations by record labels to play songs. Kennedy is of course a reference to the young senator from Massachusetts, who defeated Vice President Tricky Dick Nixon to win the presidency, putting the Democrats back in office after 8 years. Chubby Checker is a nod to the man who took the song The Twist all the way to #1 on the Billboard charts after performing the song on American Bandstand and The Dick Clark Show. A lifetime of back pain has ensued for millions. Psycho, the Alfred Hitchcock horror film, was released in 1960, influencing and impacting generations of filmgoers, and filmmakers. We all go a little mad sometimes, haven't you? Belgians in the Congo, the last reference in the verse, is of course about the independence of the Republic of the Congo from Belgium, despite continued Belgian presence and impact there. We have a tidy little video about that too. See the show notes. We didn't start the fire. No, we didn't light it, but we tried to fight it. The fourth verse covers only 3 years, starting in 1961, but they are rather packed with events. The first reference is to Hemingway, being of course the author whose suicide that year, following a long struggle with depression, rocked the literary world. Eichmann is a reference to the 1960 capture and transfer from Argentina to Israel by the Israeli Mossad and Shin Bet of the Nazi war crime criminal Adolf Eichmann. He was later tried and executed for crimes against humanity. Stranger in a Strange Land, on the other hand, is the 1961 Robert Heinlein science fiction novel, which would go on to win the Hugo Award for Best Novel the following year. For those who may be interested, this is the book that coined the word grok. 1961 is also the year that Robert Zimmerman signed a contract with Columbia and has since become one of America's greatest poets. Bob didn't change his last name until the following year to the more familiar Dylan. Berlin is a reference to 2 things that year: the Berlin Crisis, one of the most tense standoffs of the Cold War, where US and Soviet tanks stood facing each other only meters apart, and the start of the construction of the Berlin Wall, perhaps the single most iconic symbol of the period. Bay of Pigs invasion is of course a reference to the catastrophic CIA-backed invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles. The failure was not only salt in the wound of American inability to deal with Castro, but helped to solidify the communist regime on the island. 1962 begins with acknowledgement of the film Lawrence of Arabia, released that year. The biopic, starring Peter O'Toole, would win numerous awards. The soundtrack by Maurice Jarre is fantastic, and it spawned the greatest talk show appearance of all time. Look up Peter O'Toole, Camel, and Letterman and see if you don't agree. British Beatlemania is the next reference, and including this in the 1962 set is a bit of a stretch, although that is when the Beatles signed and recorded their demos. Beatlemania didn't really break until 1963, but it rhymes with Arabia, so hey, why not? Ole Miss refers to the race riot that broke out in Oxford, Mississippi, as segregationists at the University of Mississippi attempted to prevent the enrollment of James Meredith, a black man. Kennedy invoked the Insurrection Act, and 30,000 National Guardsmen were activated, 2 people died, and the university was integrated in a tremendous step forward in the modern civil rights movement. 1962 was the year that the first crewed American spaceflight took place, sending John Glenn around the Earth 3 times before safely returning to Earth. Liston beats Patterson, that is, Floyd Patterson was soundly defeated in a first-round knockout by Sonny Liston to become the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. Moving on to 1963, the first reference is to Pope Paul, that is, Pope Paul VI, who was elected Pope on the 6th ballot and who was expected to continue the reform work of the Second Vatican Council. Malcolm X, the spokesman for the Nation of Islam in 1963, evoked widespread anger in his reaction to Kennedy's assassination, referring to the event as chickens coming home to roost. He himself would be assassinated several years later. British politician sex is a reference to the Profumo affair, where the Secretary of State for War, John Profumo, was caught having an affair with a showgirl, Christine Keeler, who also happened to be involved with the Soviet naval attaché in London, Yevgeny Ivanov. The fallout from the scandal was the resignation of Prime Minister Harold Macmillan and the eventual defeat of the Conservatives in a general election the following year. JFK, blown away, what else do I have to say? We didn't start the fire, it was always burning since the world's been turning. We didn't start the fire, no, we didn't light it, but we tried to fight it. So moving to the last verse, this is where we start to see the timescale accelerate. There are only 24 references covering the years 1964 to 1989. Considering the song was written to highlight that the 1950s and early 1960s, when Joel was a kid, was an eventful time period, this kind of does make sense. Skipping 1964 completely, birth control marks the 1965 Scottish decision of Griswold versus Connecticut, which allowed for married couples to use contraceptives without government restriction based on grounds of privacy. The precedent established in Griswold would be later cited in multiple other cases related to sexual privacy. Ho Chi Minh is a reference to the North Vietnamese president in the year that US combat troops began to deploy to South Vietnam as the American attempt to contain communism in Southeast Asia escalated dramatically. Richard Nixon Back Again is a reference to the 1968 election of Richard Nixon, who we last saw in this 1960 Kennedy reference. Nixon and his VP Spiro Agnew overwhelmingly defeated both of his opponents, Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace. Quickly moving on to 1969, Moonshot is of course the Apollo 11 landing on the moon by astronauts Louis Armstrong and Buzz Lightyear. Booyakasha! Woodstock refers to the music festival which attracted over 400,000 people to upstate New York and is often recognized as the high point of the hippie counterculture in America. Go listen to Hendrix perform and get back to me. Moving forward to 1972, that was the year the Watergate scandal broke, where members of Nixon's re-election campaign were caught breaking into the DNC headquarters to plant listening devices. The efforts of the administration to cover up the scandal resulted in Richard Nixon's resignation, because that's what politicians used to do when caught breaking the law. Punk rock is not associated firmly to any one year, but it emerged as a musical force in the early to mid-1970s. Thematically linked to anti-establishment messaging, early punk pioneers that helped popularize the genre include the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, the Stooges, and the Clash. Hey ho, let's go! The next reference is to Menachem Begin, elected Israel's PM in 1976. He would be key in negotiating the Camp David Accords in 1978, thus bringing a lasting and forever peace to the Middle East. Right? Right? Reagan is of course Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California and B-list actor who began a campaign for president in 1976, losing to Gerald Ford in the primaries, but obviously positioning himself for the 1980 campaign. Palestine is obviously a reference to the struggle for independence and autonomy in the Israeli-occupied territory, which has a forever quality to it. Terror on the Airline is a call-out by Joel of the rapid increase of airline hijackings that were taking place in the mid-1970s. Notable among these was the Air France Flight 139, which eventually made its way to Uganda, where it was stormed by Israeli commandos, freeing most of the hostages. Ayatollahs in Iran marks the Iranian Revolution, where the deeply unpopular Shah was overthrown and replaced by a theocracy led by the Ayatollahs, who remain in power as of the recording of this video. Russians in Afghanistan rounds out the 1970s, where the Soviet army deployed to neighboring Afghanistan to protect socialism there. What followed was a 10-year guerrilla war, which resulted in the withdrawal of the Soviet Union and civil war and jihadist movements in Afghanistan. The second half of the last verse takes us rapidly into the 1980s, where in 1981, Wheel of Fortune, the American game show, brings in Pat Sajak and Vanna White as hosts. Sajak would remain host until 2024, while White is still there, clapping away. I'd like to buy a vowel. Sally Ride is a reference that takes us to 1983, when the physicist became the first American woman in space on board the Space Shuttle Challenger. Heavy Metal Suicide is a 1984 reference to John Daniel McCallum, a 19-year-old who committed suicide after listening to the Ozzy Osbourne song Suicide Solution. McCallum's parents filed a lawsuit blaming the heavy metal artist, but failed to prove their case. This heavy metal scare is one of several moral panics that mark the 1980s. Foreign debts is a nod to a wave of countries, especially across Latin America, defaulting on their national debts. Joel's next reference is to homeless vets, the increased public awareness of the situation faced by many veterans of the Vietnam War who were experiencing the untreated effects of PTSD and lacked support and access to care. The 1980s was racked by the AIDS crisis and was subject to extreme amounts of fear, misinformation, and bigotry. At the time, a positive diagnosis of HIV, which would lead to AIDS, was seen as an almost death sentence, but thanks to decades of research and destigmatization, it is now not only treatable to allow a normal life, but it is also preventable. Crack, the next reference Joel makes, is to crack cocaine, a recreational drug that swept through American inner cities from the mid-1980s. The crack epidemic, as it was called, was met with increased prosecutions and harsher sentences that largely impacted already marginalized communities, especially African American ones. Bernie Goetz is a reference to a 1984 shooting on the New York City subway where Bernard Goetz shot 4 men who Goetz alleged tried to rob him. Goetz claimed self-defense and would be found not guilty of attempted murder or assault, but would serve 8 months of a 1-year sentence for unlawful possession of a weapon. The case brought up issues of vigilantism, racism, and trust in law enforcement. Moving into the last reference of the song, Joel next mentions hypodermics on the shore, referring to the so-called syringe tide in New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut in 1987 and 1988, where improperly disposed of medical waste from a landfill in Staten Island was washing up on beaches in the area. The sharp drop in tourism had a substantial impact on regions like the Jersey Shore, until Snooki brought them back, of course. China's under martial law brings us to 1989 and the June Declaration of Martial Law in China to end the student-led pro-democracy protests, which Beijing would like us to all believe never actually happened. The image of the so-called tank man, a lone figure standing in sole defiance of a line of Chinese tanks, has gone on to be globally famous. Rock and Roller Cola Wars is the last line in the song and is a nod to the marketing war being waged between Coke and Pepsi, each of which lead into sponsorship deals with global superstars like Whitney Houston and Michael Jackson. The Cola Wars were serious business at a time where capitalism was clearly seen as ascendant. We didn't start the fire, but when we're gone, it will still burn on and on and on and on and on and on and on, kind of like this episode. And that brings us to the almost end of the episode. I don't know that this song really teaches us anything about the Cold War. Well, other than maybe there was an awful lot of individual events going on all of the time that we don't really necessarily ever think about as weaving a wider fabric of events. The backdrop of life, if you will. And to me, that's what the song reveals across its almost 120 separate references. Historical time periods, like the Cold War, can be distilled into a series of major occurrences, but even major events are still taking place among regular life going on. Music, films, medicine, births and deaths. Of course, we also need to consider that We Didn't Start the Fire is very much an American song. The references aren't necessarily all American, but they are all things that had impacted the US. There's no reason that this song couldn't have its own Soviet version, or Chinese version, or Indian, and so on. The fact that I continue to see new fan-created lyric sets for this song, but referring to current events, just demonstrates to me our need to contextualize events and highlight that life may always feel like, to quote, an unfixable mess, and yet we still burn on and on and on and on. As a quick side note to close things out, I'd like to point out that We Didn't Start the Fire, although it is clearly a Cold War song, isn't even the best Cold War song on the Stormfront album it was released on. That honor, without a doubt, goes to the song Leningrad, a mirrored story of American and Soviet kids born after the war and living through the same events from different sides of the Iron Curtain, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Korean War, and Vietnam. As for my own personal favorite Cold War song, well, that honor has to fall to Nena's 1983 hit, 99 Luftballon, although Alphaville's Forever Young is a close second. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which has decided never to do an episode like this ever again. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.